So like good fortune or tragedy, pick your preference, changes to the United States Constitution come almost exclusively in groups. Following the ratification of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and the passage of the 11th Amendment in 1795 and the 12th in 1804, there were no further amendments to the Constitution for 61 years after 1804. So no constitutional amendments for 61 years and then 3 in 50 months. After the Reconstruction Amendments that I'll talk about now, during the Gilded Age and for much of the Progressive era that followed, there were no further amendments to the Constitution for another 43 years. Then in the space of 7.5 years, from 1913 to 1920, there were 4 more constitutional amendments. 2 more in 1933, another in 1951, that's the one limiting presidential terms, and then another 4 from 1961 to 1971. So there are 3 periods where we see truly major constitutional change, or change to the Constitution, 3 or 4 amendments. Now, since the 26th Amendment in 1971, lowering the voting age, there's been just one, the 27th Amendment, in 1992. And the 27th Amendment, which relates to congressional compensation, was intended as part of the original Bill of Rights. So amendments to the Constitution have come almost exclusively during eras of reform, and there have just been a few periods of intense constitutional change in American history. Now, these observations, I think, lend themselves equally to the conservative argument that the wisdom of the Founding Fathers shouldn't be questioned, the Constitution should be strictly interpreted and should not change with the political winds, but also to that of liberals that the Constitution, with its 17 amendments since the Bill of Rights, is a document that has changed significantly over time and should continue to do so to meet the changing needs of society. Whatever your political persuasion, the process by which the Constitution has been amended basically in groups can support your argument if you're creative. Now, the Constitution has changed significantly, but as mentioned, it's almost exclusively in periods marked by liberal dominance. 11 of the 17 constitutional amendments were passed in 3 periods, together totaling just 22 years. Think about it. 1865 to 1870, 1913 to 1920, and 1961 to 1971. Those 22 years saw 11 of the 17 amendments. That's 1 amendment every 2 years. Leaving out the 27th Amendment, which was part of the original Bill of Rights, or was to have been, and beginning with the 11th Amendment in 1791, we've seen 3 periods, 1791 to 1865, 1870 to 1913, and 1920 to 1961. 3 periods totaling 158 years. During which there were only 5 amendments to the Constitution, or roughly 1 every 31 years. So the Reconstruction Amendments are a product of one of those periods of intense change. And the magnitude of the changes, the magnitude of the moment, is very difficult to underestimate. As you know, nearly 620,000 Americans died in the Civil War during 4 years of combat, and the population at the time was roughly 35 million. That's about 2% of the population. Demographic losses of that scale, if applied to today's population, would amount to approximately 6.5 million dead. Well over 100 times the losses that the US experienced during the Vietnam War, and at roughly half the time of intensive combat. Add to that the human factor, the factor of freedom. 4 million former slaves, now emancipated freedmen and women. Also add the factor of Republican control of Congress, and also consider the heightened Southern resistance to Republican control during Reconstruction, which made Reconstruction an even tougher proposition for the South. Add those things together, and we can only be left with the conclusion that it would have been astonishing if the Constitution had not changed significantly during the Reconstruction era. Now the amendments, the three amendments you're aware of. The 13th Amendment, of course, prohibits slavery. The 14th guarantees citizenship, and the 15th establishes voting rights for African Americans. But those three amendments are perhaps best viewed as one of four legacies of Reconstruction. So the amendments we could count as one of those legacies. Southern resentment we could count as another. And that Southern resentment is evidenced in the Black Codes passed immediately after the Civil War, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and a long history of state-sanctioned racism across the South. But there's a third legacy of Reconstruction that's often forgotten about, and forgetting has a lot to do with this legacy, and that's the growth of Northern disillusionment. In the North, there had been a truly deep desire to transform the nation. Not that there had not been intense racism in the North, there was, but there was for a moment, perhaps a moment of a decade, a pretty intense desire to truly transform the South. But then the North became increasingly disillusioned by the effort, tired of the effort, and the grand moral idealism of the Republican Party, the effort to create black equality, was deflated. And it wouldn't return again until the 1950s and 60s. So Southern resentment, but also Northern disillusionment. And then the fourth legacy of Reconstruction that you're probably quite familiar with is the ascendancy of Congress and the decline of the presidency. This is a period that's often referred to, the late 19th century, as the twilight of the American presidency. The period from the death of Lincoln to the inauguration of Theodore Roosevelt, inauguration through assassination, through the actual beginning of Roosevelt's term, that period has come to be known as the twilight of the presidency. And when you think about it, well, Ulysses S. Grant is known for the corruption of his administration. All of the 19th century, late 19th century presidents are generally known for having significant facial hair, except for William McKinley. But Hayes, Ulysses S. Grant for corruption, Rutherford B. Hayes for the disputed election that got him into power. James Garfield is distinguished largely for the brevity of his administration, shot 4 months into his term. Chester A. Arthur is remembered, let's be honest, for not being so bad. But his own party didn't like him very much. Grover Cleveland only had a mustache. But he served 2 non-consecutive terms. That may be the biggest reason why we remember his administration. And also his second term in office ran concurrent with what was the worst economic depression in history up to that time, and perhaps the single worst 4 years of economic depression the nation has ever experienced, from 1893 to 1897. And then William McKinley, no facial hair whatsoever. He did serve 2 terms. He's the first president since Grant to be re-elected into consecutive terms. My point, though, is really that the presidency was weak, terribly weak, in the late 19th century because of Reconstruction, because of the struggle between Congress and the presidency. And in the late 19th century, Congress was very much on the rise and playing a very, very big part in the making of legislation. But of those 4 legacies of Reconstruction, so the amendment, Southern resentment, Northern disillusionment, and the rise of Congress and twilight of the presidency, of those 4 legacies, the most enduring are the amendments. The 14th Amendment doesn't receive the full backing of the federal government until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's 96 years later. It's ratified in 1868. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gives it full federal enforcement. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 provides the full federal enforcement for the 15th Amendment, providing the franchise. The 15th Amendment ratified in 1870, so it's 95 years before that amendment receives the full weight of federal backing for enforcement. But nonetheless, those amendments were on the books. Slavery had been ended, civil rights and voting rights had been granted, and they were powerful foundations for the later expansion of civil rights for the nation's minority populations. The 14th Amendment is very much a product of that tangle between the executive and congressional branches of government during Reconstruction. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is pushed through Congress in mid-March by the radical Republicans in response to the passage of black codes in the South. I think you have a sense of the black codes which restricted movement, which prevented African Americans from changing employment. The black codes essentially reinstituted slavery in all but name. The 1866 Civil Rights Act declared that all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed, were citizens entitled to full and equal benefits of the law. It's interesting to look at the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868 but presented later in 1866, and see that the language of the Civil Rights Act is the language of the 14th Amendment. And no great surprise there, because President Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, claiming that it would foment discord between the races and insisting that it expanded too greatly the scope of federal power. But Congress overrode the president's veto in the spring of 1866, and then in an effort to ensure no further doubt about the legality of the Civil Rights Act, Congress recommended a new constitutional amendment. It passed Congress in June 1866 and would be ratified by the states 2 years later. The Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, as we'll see, has ended up as the basis for protecting corporations from regulation by the states. I'll talk about that later this morning. The amendment, the 14th Amendment, also effectively prohibited the president from granting pardons to former Confederate leaders. But perhaps most memorable is that with Unionists in control of the South, President Johnson's own state of Tennessee actually became the first state in the nation to ratify the 14th Amendment. And there were race riots in Memphis and New Orleans in May and June of 1866. White mobs and local police indiscriminately massacred African Americans in Memphis and New Orleans, and radical Republicans in Congress blamed those massacres of black people on the president, said that his opposition to the 14th Amendment was what was inciting mobs in the South to violence. The rest of the story is well known. The radical Republicans win a sweeping victory in the 1866 midterm elections, and they push through a wave of new legislation designed to transform the South and confer rights upon the newly emancipated population. 10 Confederate states get placed under military rule, divided into 5 military districts. Tennessee is excluded from that process because it has ratified the 14th Amendment. The other states are allowed back into the Union only after they've ratified the 14th Amendment. And with Congress firmly in the driving seat and the presidency thoroughly weakened by the impeachment proceedings in early 1868, the 15th Amendment passes Congress in early 1869 and gets ratified in early 1870. Ratification of the 15th Amendment is a precondition for re-entry into the Union for 3 southern states, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia. So clearly, the politics of Reconstruction, the tangle between the president and Congress, are key to understanding the 14th and 15th Amendments. But there's one thing that gets forgotten to history all too often, and that's that the controversy surrounding the 15th Amendment concern not just the powerlessness of the South to resist its ratification. And that's something we hear a lot of, even in the present, that those constitutional amendments were passed when the South was powerless to resist them, that the process of pushing through those amendments was not fully democratic because the North had control of the South. But one other thing to consider is perhaps the failure of Congress to entertain the possibility of far more sweeping legislation with the 14th Amendment. The American Equal Rights Association, at its National Convention in New York in May 1867, adopted the following resolutions. First, resolved that the present claim for manhood suffrage, marked with the words equal, impartial, and universal, is a cruel abandonment of the slave women of the South, a fraud on the tax-paying women of the North, and an insult to the civilization of the 19th century. The second resolution was that the Republican Party proposal to reconstruct our government on the basis of manhood suffrage, which has received the recent sanction of the American Anti-Slavery Society, is but a continuation of the old system of class and caste, always a cruel and prescriptive form, and ending in all ages in national degradation and revolution. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Frederick Douglass all signed the petition. There was discussion about whether the amendment might be expanded to include women too. We need to ask, should we view the 15th Amendment as an opportunity lost for universal suffrage, regardless of sex, or accept the Republican Party argument of the time that this was the Negro's hour? What is clear is that if the United States had considered and approved a much expanded 15th Amendment in 1870, it would have been ahead of the rest of the world that it measured itself against. And by that, I mean white European nations and white settler societies. Those were the United States measures in the late 19th century. Whether it was a white settler society in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, it was places where other white European settlers had gone. But then again, if the US had taken that bold step a half century before it did, in 1920, which I'll talk about later this morning, then the rest of the world might have followed in 1870. Anyway, that's a story for later. Suffice to say for now that there's actually more debate today about whether the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments should have been passed at all than there is over whether the 15th Amendment should have been granted to women as well as men. And it was a remarkable debate in the immediate post-Civil War years. It hasn't been completely lost to history, but it's hardly been the kind of up front and center issue for historians that it ought to be. As for the enduring critics of the Reconstruction Amendments who argue that they were imposed upon the South through an unconstitutional process, well, what can one say? Surely an end to slavery, along with civil rights and voting rights for those who had endured the pain of slavery, hardly seems radical from the vantage point of the more enlightened present. The changes, though, were absolutely massive for the time. It's so important to remember that those changes to the Constitution were simply enormous. And that helps explain why the 14th and 15th Amendments were not properly enforced for 4 and 5 generations in some parts of the South. It helps explain the black codes, which are an effort to effectively overturn the 13th Amendment. Southern opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 invoked the rhetoric of a second Reconstruction imposed on the South again by the federal government. And there was some logic to that opposition. In the South, during Reconstruction, the North had control over the political system. During the Civil Rights era in the 50s and 60s, the federal government did impose its will on the South. But the real question, of course, is whether such impositions and the constitutional changes that accompany them are not sometimes necessary to ensure the progress of the nation. It's important to remember that the Constitution did recognize slavery. It recognized it in a pretty clear and apparent fashion. The 3/5 clause for representation in the House of Representatives, and an express prohibition in the Constitution for ending the slave trade before 1808. A final point, last June in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court struck down a central provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one that allows the Justice Department to review prospective election changes in states and counties with a history of racially motivated voter discrimination. Supporters of the Supreme Court's decision contend that these nearly 50-year-old provisions were pertinent to a previous era, the 1950s and 60s, but not to the more racially enlightened, non-discriminatory America of today. So, on the other hand, critics of that Supreme Court ruling charge that it paves the way for those states with deep legacies of racially based restrictions on voting to impose a new set of restrictions, identification laws, etc., that stem from the expressed desire to reimpose the racial hierarchy of that previous era. Now, whatever one's perspective and conclusions on the matter of this change, the ruling is one more reminder that the long history of the Reconstruction Amendments, the judicial foundations for the major civil rights legislation of the 60s, is very much alive with us today, 143 years after the last of those amendments was ratified.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.